The first thing you encounter as you start to accumulate the textbooks and the web links and phone apps necessary for the study of Latin in the 21st century, um, the first thing you encounter are the rationalizations, excuses, and apologetics offered by your contemporaneous students of Latin and the professors who parasitically earn their living peddling these delusions of grandeur to the students. Okay? First thing you're going to encounter is, the truly esoteric argument that Latin is not a dead language and that studying Latin is not useless. There are actually several books where the title is a paraphrase, is within a few words of studying Latin is not useless, Latin is not a dead language, in defense of studying a useless language, the reasons why it is crucially important to study an ancient, dead, useless language. So sometimes it's the title of the book, sometimes it's the preface of the book, sometimes it's the first chapter, sometimes it's the most popular YouTube video on the YouTuber's channel, sometimes it's kind of the front page of the website or what have you. Depending on the format, these rationalizations are what you encounter first and foremost. Now, a culturally comparative claim must be carefully calibrated. Let's say that one more time in case English is your second language. The majority of my viewers, English is their second language. A culturally comparative claim must be carefully calculated. If I told you that living in Canada was depressing for me because everyone was either a drug addict or an alcoholic, I'm surrounded by people who are drug addicts and alcoholics. Well, compared to what? I've had some fans of the channel encouraging me to move to Sweden, to live the rest of my life permanently in Sweden. Do you think the rate of alcohol consumption is higher or lower in Sweden than it is in Canada? That might be quite difficult to get a feeling for in the real world. And statistics can be misleading if you just use statistics generated by the alcohol industry itself, if you do some research into it. Okay, well, what if I said to you that I've lived in Thailand, an abstemious Theravada Buddhist country, and I feel like I'm just surrounded by alcoholics and drug addicts? Totally different culture, totally different language. Well, Sweden is quite different from Canada. All right. Culturally comparative claims have to be calibrated very carefully. I used to study a dead language that is much more alive today than Latin is. It's much more alive as a language. It's much more alive in terms of the continuity of the cultural tradition behind it. I'm talking about Pali. So I'm going to briefly talk about Pali and Sanskrit. And some of you watching this video might decide to study Pali and Sanskrit instead of Latin on this basis, if this is what you're looking for. Slavery was abolished in Thailand in the year 1910. So when I was doing research in Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, and that area of Southeast Asia, there were still people alive who could remember slavery. And slavery does not just betoken slavery. Slavery was part and parcel of a whole ancient Weltanschauung, view of the world, way of life, set of assumptions, traditional, deeply held traditional beliefs. When you say slavery was abolished in 1910, that's a good indication of when Thailand started making its transition from the medieval world to the modern world, a world where, assumptions about government, the role of the king, assumptions about religion, assumptions about geography, what is the planet we're living on, cosmology, including, when you look at the night sky, what do you think the sun and the moon are? I'm not asking you, what do you think the moon symbolically represents? No, like physically, what is it? you know, like Thailand's transition into the modern world has happened so recently that when I was there, still people were alive who could remember slavery. Yes, they were 90 years old or what have you. And I found one article written in English. To my knowledge, it's the only article of this kind ever written. It maybe something else has been published and never translated in English or never been noticed. But one anthropologist went around from village to village interviewing elderly people who could remember slavery. And obviously that was a few years before I got there. So I don't know if those people were in their 80s or in their 90s, but there were some. And now that kind of memory is passed on for a couple of generations. So obviously when I was there were people whose parents had told them about slavery and whose grandparents had told them about slavery. And there were people alive who could tell you, obviously the first time electricity had arrived, the first time they ever saw a European, perhaps the first time a white person ever came to their village or their province of Thailand, wouldn't be the absolute first foreigner to ever come to Thailand. But the memory of the emergence from the ancient world, it was very palpable. It was very close. You could step into and kind of have contact with ancient attitudes towards the world. And in this sense, the ancient literature, although in some ways it was completely incomprehensible to people in modern Thailand, like they just could not read it, in some ways they still lived with it in a way that, of course, the people of Italy do not live with Latin today. That's what I'm coming back to. In the way which nobody in modern Europe has any contact with what the Latin tradition was. And I don't even mean narrowly ancient Rome, the whole, classical tradition. The whole classical tradition in Europe is much more dead than the Pali tradition in Southeast Asia, places like Myanmar. It's much more dead than the Hindu tradition linked to Sanskrit in India, right? There are ancient attitudes that you as an anthropologist, as a philologist, as a tourist, as an archaeologist, you can still really have contact with the continuum of ancient culture by studying a language like Pali, by studying a language like Sanskrit. So, and you can't do this through Latin. It's bullshit. And it's really a kind of pernicious lie that the Latin tutors are telling and that Latin students and polyglot YouTubers are telling one another. Now, just to give you a couple of examples, what I mean by an ancient worldview that still really persists in Asia, what have you. Professor Gombrich, who I knew, we spoke face to face, and then we stayed in touch by email for a couple of years, and then we stopped. It's another story. How I stopped talking to Professor Gombrich. Story for another video. Professor Gombrich, when he was in Sri Lanka, interviewing Buddhist monks and traditional, true believing members of the Buddhist faith, they told him things that indicated implicitly they believed the earth was flat. One example, which is kind of devious in its implications, he spoke to one very traditional Buddhist monk who believed that the earth was hottest at the north and south extremes. I can't say the North Pole and the South Pole because I don't think this guy visualized it as a sphere, but whatever. And he thought that the temperature was most moderate in the middle, what we would think of as the equator. So this is an adult man who's become a scholar of Buddhism in the 20th century. He can read and he can write in at least 2 languages, and he can have this conversation. And his whole view of the world, his assumptions, not just about ethics, not just about morality, but about like physics and geography and cosmology. So real contact with the kind of continuous ancient culture that's ongoing there. Now, to my knowledge, Professor Gombrich did not try to debunk this guy's view of the world. I think he felt a little bit like he was regarding an exotic beast in a zoo. Like, wow, people like you still really exist. So, are there people in Sri Lanka who still believe in ghosts, who still believe in yetis? Yeah, the yeti. It's a real ancient superstitious belief in that part of the world, who believe in, the magical and supernatural elements of ancient Buddhism. Yes, there are. Are there people who still believe in slavery, who believe in the caste system, who believe in all kinds of magical and super? Yes, there are. I mean, in Sri Lanka, you can still contact that. And Gombrich's first book, it's his only good book. Just say all his later books are bad. But he had one really great book about his experience in Sri Lanka, and it has a lot of these anecdotes that shows the way in which the ancient and the modern were living together somewhat uncomfortably in Sri Lanka at that time. Now, when I spoke to Gombrich face to face, he and I were trading these stories because I had been out on the edge of the jungle in Laos. I mean, I wasn't in Myanmar, but when you're in northwestern Laos, you're on the edge of the jungle in Myanmar, and you're talking to people from Myanmar. I did cross into Myanmar, but I'm just saying I was on the border with Myanmar, and Yunnan and Thailand, because I was in the most rugged and remote areas. I also had this experience of really meeting and talking to people who still preserved more ancient view of the world, more ancient cosmology. Again, this for some of you guys, this won't be touching in the way it is for me. I remember talking to another scholar of Buddhism, not Richard Gombrich, another guy, and he was just talking about when you could meet and speak with elderly people, for example, in northern Myanmar, who still really felt that where they were living, their town was walking distance from where the Buddha lived and where the Buddha died. And like when they would talk to you about these ancient myths written in a language they can't read Pali, they can't read Sanskrit, like they're cut off from the literature in that sense. Whereas I'm not, I can read it because it's that language. Where they like gesture, like, oh yeah, they're mentioning some mountain or some river or some city or village that's in the life of the Buddha, and they're gesturing and talking about it very much as if it's walking distance away, like it's maybe 3 days hike from here. Their cosmology, their view of the world, and this is not like a magical cosmology. These are like cities and mountains that really existed in India, but they're very close to Nepal. They're in that part of India, Nepal and the adjacent part of India, just over the border between Nepal and northeastern India. It's an indescribably far distance and a very rugged journey from, say, northern Thailand to Nepal. It's not just distance, it's the terrain and the climate and everything else. Good luck surviving even now if you want to travel on foot between Nepal and northern Thailand. It would be an incredible adventure. Well, in the ancient world, you're even more likely to lose your life on such a voyage. But that is how they thought of the world. And of course, on paper, you can still see this even amongst Buddhists in Japan. People in Japan who really felt they were very close to and very much in contact with this tradition, that again, they can't even read the text. They're not able to read the Bible. Now, coming back to what I was just saying about Richard Gombrich, when I spoke to him in person, I was kind of giving him some wonderful stories of this kind, and he really wasn't giving me wonderful stories. I already knew his stories from his book, to be honest with you. But this is the kind of Buddhism that still existed at that time amongst Buddhist monks who lived in a cave and knew what it was to be attacked by a bear and knew what it was to be attacked by a python, what it was to live amongst the wild beasts of the jungle and come back to tell the tale. Those are the guys I'd met. Those are the stories I'd heard. And of course, I got to know some of the peasants who were out there killing the pythons, frankly, and killing the bears. That's a really nasty business. People who were part of the lay people who were brutally exploiting the same jungles and cutting them down. That was part of the magic of the milieu I was living in. Anyway, I'm kind of trading these sorts of stories with Gombrich, and I'm telling him how much I appreciated the stories of that kind in his book, in his first book. His later books, not so much. And he sat there and he said very sincerely that he felt today nobody could do research the way he had done just a few decades earlier. He said that he felt the world he inhabited in Sri Lanka at that time has now disappeared. That there was this historical period where the ancient and the modern were juxtaposed and living together, and you could still really have contact with that tradition, and now it's gone. As an example of that, I met and spoke to a monk who was an old man but he had become a Buddhist monk 8 years old or 11 years old. As a small child, he had become a monk. And I'm meeting him as an old man. And he was telling me that he learned Pali, he learned the ancient language under the last living master of the Kachayana Vyakarana. So teaching Pali through the Kachayana Vyakarana, that is the method of teaching Pali in Pali. So you're not explaining the language in English. You're not explaining the language in Sinhalese, right? Ideally, the same way today, one of the most popular Latin textbooks, it teaches Latin in Latin. Well, the idea was that this was a method. It was very ancient. It's not as ancient as the life of the Buddha. It developed after the death of the Buddha sometime. We can get into exactly when does this tradition begin. But this was the ancient tradition of how this ancient language was taught before European influence and before book publishing existed, right? These people had writing, but they didn't have printing and publishing. They didn't have our kinds of systems of formal education. Well, so I managed to meet the man. He may be dead now of old age. And he was describing to me how he was a very young boy and he knew this monk and he studied with this elderly monk in just the last few years before that monk died. And that monk was the last living example of this connection to this more ancient tradition of Pali as a language. So likewise, if you're talking about Sanskrit in India, and India is a huge country. It's not just huge in population. It is actually huge in size. India looks smaller on a map than it really is. Let me put it that way. Province by province in India, you're going to have a different story. Maybe in some places, the connection to those ancient attitudes is still very much alive today. Maybe in some places, people will tell you, oh, you just missed it. Just 50 years ago, there were people who were really part of this ancient continuous tradition, and now they're all dead, and the next generation didn't continue it. And in some places, there's going to be this kind of juxtaposition of the ancient and modern living side by side. Now, whether your interest is anthropological or political, or you just want to have a period of your life where you prove your own genius and test your own mettle and test your own nerve, I am certainly in a position to tell you about all of the ways in which getting on that path is rewarding, whether it be, Pali or Sanskrit. But, let me tell you something. In both traditions, whether we're talking about Sanskrit Hinduism or Pali Buddhism, you are talking about meeting people who believe in magic. They are afraid of ghosts. They perform rituals in order to kind of manage the ghost population. In that religion, you never get rid of ghosts in those two religions. You never win over the ghosts. You just manage the ghost infestation that's around you all the time. These are people who believe in demons. They believe in hell. They believe there are certain days on the calendar when the demons in hell, there are certain rituals you have to do to deal with them and so on. These are people who believe they are being watched by the gods and that their actions have supernatural significance. It's no joke. So, in that sense, the ancient culture, it's still alive today. It's still continuous. Okay? Think about how many waves of conquest have submerged India. Okay? Yes, everyone knows India was conquered by the British. Well, it wasn't only the British. Okay? The British, the Portuguese, in little bits and pieces, the French and the Spanish also tried, but the most important conquest of all was that they were conquered by the Muslims, to be blunt. And the Muslim conquest of India, it really did destroy both the Hindu tradition and the Buddhist tradition. And in a sense, the one that's talking to least is the animist tradition, the indigenous religious traditions that were neither Buddhist nor Hindu, but existed alongside them. This is all, the temples were physically destroyed. The monks and swamis were massacred. The texts were burned. The gold statues were melted down, and so on and so forth. The raiding and looting and pillaging, the piratical nature of the Muslim conquest of India. This was the devastation caused by this to the culture and the tradition is far greater than the devastation caused by the British conquest of India. And that is indeed one of the reasons why the Hindus were somewhat detached in their attitude toward being piece by piece conquered and controlled by the British Empire, because they had recent experience with other empires. Now Sri Lanka, it's a somewhat different sequence. In Sri Lanka, the Dutch are very important. I didn't mention the Dutch there, but with Sri Lanka, conquered by the Portuguese, conquered by the Dutch, conquered by the British. But do you know who was even worse? Being conquered by the Tamils. Being conquered by the Tamils was so violent. It was so terrible. The Buddhist temples were burned down. The Buddhist texts were stacked up and lit in fire and burned. The violence of the Tamil conquest was so terrible that when the Portuguese show up, you think, hey, maybe these latest conquistadors, maybe we can work with them. Maybe we can cut a deal. I'm not saying everyone in Sri Lanka felt that way, but yes, there was, to use the Portuguese term, there were compradors willing to work. Okay. My point is this. As violent and extreme as that military history is, as violent and extreme as that history of cultural transformation is, nevertheless, the Pali tradition in Buddhism continued. Nevertheless, the Sanskrit tradition in Hinduism continued. And Western Europe is in denial about the extent to which Latin is a dead language. Come back to my first claim here. Cultural comparisons must be carefully calibrated. In what sense is Latin an utterly dead language? Is Latin a failure? Compared to the continuity that remains for an ancient language like Sanskrit, compared to the continuity that remains for an ancient language like Pali. And I think there's even an argument. If you are serious about classical Chinese, so let's say Han Dynasty Chinese and the materials we have that are more ancient than the Han Dynasty. So what people mean by classical Chinese isn't always clear. I'm being completely clear. So the really ancient, really classical Chinese, Han Dynasty and earlier Chinese, even though the communists had their revolution in China, I think there's an argument that classical Chinese is much more of a living language. It has much more viable cultural continuity, right, than Latin has today. All right. Now, belief is a somewhat porous and flexible and misleading concept. Let's talk about fear. Nobody today is afraid of the gods described from ancient Rome, the pre-Christian gods. When you are talking about sincere, true believing Buddhists, sincere, true believing Hindus, or a sincere, true believing Taoist in China, a traditional Taoist who valorizes and studies these ancient Chinese texts. It's not the only type of person in China who cares about these, but these are people who are genuinely afraid of these things they believe in. To some extent, their lives are dominated by fear. They make decisions on the basis of fear all the time. I'm sorry, I probably mentioned this example before, maybe 5 years ago on the channel. An anecdote from a colleague of mine who was living in Taiwan, and he described a Taiwanese Taoist woman, and she was scheduling her abortion to minimize the extent to which she would be haunted by the ghost of the deceased infant. So again, this comes back to my warning that in these religions, it's not like Ghostbusters. You don't ever win against the ghosts. You manage the infestation of ghosts that's there all the time. So it's not like the religion was offering her, an exception to the rules. The rule was if she, got an abortion, then the ghost of the deceased fetus would come back to haunt her. But She was being given advice based on some kind of ancient interpretation of the calendar. I don't know to what extent that's based on the positions of the stars and planets in that tradition, or to what extent it's just numerology, but some kind of magical thinking. On what day should she arrange to have the abortion? And she was making that choice to minimize the haunting that would ensue. Okay. This is someone who lives in fear. For her, these ideas from ancient texts are real. And they're real in a way that the ideas from ancient Rome never will be. For anyone in Paris, for anyone in Berlin, or for anyone in Poland. I mean, we can include Eastern Europe, which has its own remarkable history of Latinists and of the significance of Latin as a lingua franca. So I have some totally good questions from the audience here. Today's video is really just about why you should not study Latin. I guess I don't mind kind of once I'm past stating this thesis, answering some of these questions. But at this moment, I mean, I'm giving a kind of balanced and fair condemnation of Latin from the perspective of someone who has studied many, many different languages. So I don't need to digress to that at great length. I've already mentioned some of the languages I've studied. But yeah, obviously, I have a perspective on this that most of the other students won't have, most of the professors won't have. Sorry, some of these comments are interesting. I just don't want to derail the purpose of the live stream. I saw an old email between myself and a professor just a few days ago. So a few days ago, I was searching my email history for a certain keyword, and I looked at an old email from 8-9 years ago, something like that. And this professor I was talking to, the only languages he was familiar with were Spanish and Italian. Sorry, and he spoke English. And he was giving me this advice pertaining to languages. And, I had to write back to him. I said, look, dude, I'm sorry, but you're out of your depth here. If your first language is English, studying Spanish is one thing, studying Italian is one thing. You are not going to tell me about studying Chinese. You are not going to tell me about studying Cambodian. You are not going to tell me about studying Cree and Ojibwe. And I got into it a little bit. Like the kind of difficulty you're talking about, the kind of commitment, the type of investment of time and effort, and what it is you need back in terms of institutional support. So I'll just mention this email. Ultimately, what the conflict was about was that he was saying, and many professors say this, he was saying in effect, well, there's no point in complaining that the university courses are no good, that academia is corrupt, or that it's a waste of money, because, really all you need to do is, buy an airplane ticket and go to some small town and sit down with a bunch of grandmothers and grandfathers and practice the language every day. Now, look, I maybe today in modern Italy, that's possible. Maybe you can buy an airplane ticket to a small town in Italy, and you can just go and drink espresso at the coffee shop and every day chit chat with the bored elderly people at this coffee shop and build up your ability in Italian. And you don't need a professor, and you don't need a university, and you don't need anything but your backpack and a notepad. I mean, this is a kind of anthropological ideal of learning through osmosis, learning in situ and informally. Maybe with the gap between English and Italian, you can do that. Maybe with the gap between English and Spanish, you can do that. Honestly, I doubt it. I've met people who learned languages that way. They had mind-blowing gaps in their ability and accuracy after decades. It's like, okay, there are things you should have learned in your first 6 months studying this language, and you haven't learned it in your first 10 years. You just got very, very confident in a sloppy and inaccurate use of language. And maybe these people in this particular village, they've learned to kind of put up with you and humor you, and they can guess what you mean when you're really saying things incorrectly or saying things the wrong way, or what you're saying is garbled and incoherent. It makes no sense. Okay, that's Italian. That's Spanish. Do not fucking kid yourself that there is any valid inference going from Italian and Spanish over here to Cree, Ojibwe, Soto, Navajo, Nahuatl. These are hard languages. And they're not just hard for you to learn, they're hard for these people to teach. So, like, if you do find an old grandmother in a small village who speaks one of those languages I've just named, do you know how much you're imposing on her? Like, you're not her grandson. You're not her, she doesn't know you. She doesn't love you. And even if you pay her, how can you pay her enough to do the really hard work of sitting down and teaching you a language, totally alien vocabulary, syntax, grammar, totally alien etymologies? So that's radically unrelated to a Western European language. Yeah, it may seem like it's all fun and games when you're, chit-chatting with people in a Western European language that has so much in common with English, and you think you can do these things informally. Okay, well, look, Beijing Chinese, Beijing Hua, it's not like that, homie. It's a totally different game with totally different rules and totally different stakes, something totally different to win and something totally different to lose, and people ruin years of their lives and lose huge amounts of money over this. So don't fuck around in just giving people encouragement to learn a language. Okay. Ultimately, the most important reason not to learn Latin is the type of person who learns Latin and what your relationship to those people is going to be today, in the next 10 years, in the next 20 years. Now, okay, I'm in my mid-40s. I know I'm gorgeous. I'm in my mid-40s. I'm not young. And the practice I have with so many other languages, the background I have in so many other philosophical traditions, historical traditions, political traditions, so much research I've done in so many different fields, it is possible for me to do Latin, like, frankly, in 1 year, but whatever. Talk about the next 5 years, next 10 years. It is possible for Latin to be rewarding and meaningful for me, working completely in isolation, completely solo. All right. Now, I would not even say that about Chinese, kind of a topic for another video. I definitely would not say that about Japanese, to give another example. So some people watching this video are 18 years old. Some of you are 55 years old, whatever, It may be hard for you to reflect on and really be honest with yourself about what kind of positive role you're expecting these other people to play in your life and the study of this language. If you're studying Chinese, having one other person who will write to you back and forth on Facebook Messenger in Chinese, encouraging you, knowing just one person who's fluent in Chinese, where you can say to them, hey, look, I'm reading this Wikipedia article and I can't understand this sentence. And they take the time to write back to you and reply. That can be crucial, right? So I know all these fucking people, everyone my age and younger, they seem to be in denial about these kinds of social relationships. They seem to be in denial about the extent to which there has to be love and respect in the game. There have to be people you can reach out to with love and respect, and they can reach out to you with love and respect. People who are like 65 aren't fucked up about this. But I mean, I don't know whether it has to do with the internet or video game addiction, or like that people are addicted to different drugs now than they used to be addicted to. But something has changed in the culture where nobody wants to admit this kind of fragility, this kind of need. And it's not an emotional need. It's an intellectual need, right? Of course, there's emotional ramifications. But, how depressing is it to be struggling to study Chinese alone, where there isn't even that one person you can send a Facebook message to saying, hey, I'm struggling to read this particular sentence. Okay. Now, by contrast, what if you're living in a situation where you have all kinds of warm, effusive, encouraging participation in your process and experience of learning Chinese? So I didn't meet this guy. I'm sorry if I've told this experience before, but I had described to me in detail a white man who became profoundly fluent in spoken Chinese without learning written Chinese by becoming a male prostitute. He was a good-looking white man, and I was told the story in some detail. He really disliked the brain damage he got from alcohol. He was expected to stand there at a bar and chit-chat with older Chinese women. The chit-chatting was much more important than the sex. Some of these women paid him and never had sex with them. I don't know what percentage, but I got the impression many of the women just wanted to go on a date with him. And, they didn't actually want to have sex, but some of them did. And he would have to drink huge amounts of alcohol while talking to these women in Chinese for hours and hours. Like, that's his job every day, is to chit-chat with women. He's a male prostitute. Okay. Now, in some ways, this guy's life is unbelievably bleak, and his story ends sadly. I won't get into it. I never met him. I knew a guy who was personal friends with him. That's who I got the story from about this guy. Okay, as bleak and terrible as his life may be, wow, what a network, what a constellation of language exchange partners he has, coming into his life and reinforcing and helping him learn the language in every way except reading and writing, right? These women really are very motivated to talk to him. Trust me, you can live anywhere in the world, but for me, China and Taiwan are really notable examples. You can live in China or you can live in Taiwan and nobody wants to talk to your ass. You go to the grocery store, they sell you the groceries. They say, do you have a discount card to pay for that? You say yes, or you say no. Like, that's it. Nobody's helping you learn Chinese. And you can be in a situation where you are offering to do language exchange, where you are offering to work for free. You are offering to teach people English, if only they will participate with you in practicing your Chinese. And you can be in a situation where you are offering to pay money. You're offering to pay $100 a day or $100 an hour, and still nobody will help you study or practice Chinese. And let me just add, most of these guys, because it's sometimes it's women or men, but stereotypically a white man who goes and gets a Chinese girlfriend, a lot of you guys end up sleeping with someone who's not going to help you learn the language. I mean, a certain type of self-disciplined intellectual woman will teach you the language. Is that who you're fucking? We can flip it around and ask the same, but women dating men, and there are different kinds of gender dynamics involved there. Even if it's just one relationship, you're not a prostitute, there's one person you're sleeping with. Are they teaching language? Okay, as bleak a picture as I've just painted for you there, how does that compare to your situation? What kind of colleagues you can have learning Latin? You have none of those options learning Latin. You can't prostitute yourself. You can't do anything. It is a totally dead language. And the type of person who learns this language, they are the worst kind of LARPer. If you don't know the term in English, LARP, LARPing, LARPer, live action role play. Now, there's no better comparison than Latin and Esperanto in this respect. Okay. Well, the other comparison I'm doing is, Latin to other ancient languages like Pali, Sanskrit, and classical Chinese. With Latin, people begin with an abstract ideal. And then they try to summon up a desire. They try to contrive a desire they don't really have in pursuit of that ideal. If you're talking about a white man, 21 years old, who decides to start learning Japanese, the desire is real, right? And the desire may be based on watching Japanese pornography, and it may be based on watching Japanese cartoons, anime, manga, etc., right? It may be based on Japanese video games. 21-year-old man, 21-year-old white European man who wants to learn Japanese. The desire is real. He starts with a desire, and then he will contrive an ideal to justify the desire. 21-year-old white man in Europe who decides to learn Latin begins with an ideal and then tries to contrive the desire. A stereotypical ideologue who learns Esperanto or teaches Esperanto is left-wing or even communist, believes in world peace and a kind of stereotypical left-wing hippie view of racism and anti-racism. We had people trying to teach Esperanto in Cambodia to Cambodians. Could someone Google that for me right now? Is there still an Esperanto school in Cambodia? You could also Google Vientiane, the capital city of Laos. Okay. Left-wing ideologues LARPing, they are the people studying Esperanto, teaching Esperanto. They are the spirit of Esperanto, I feel like. Okay? I got bad news for you. The ideologues attached to Latin, they're not just right-wing. They're quite literally neo-Nazis. The people who are dressing up in togas on YouTube, the people who are talking about the greatness of the Roman Empire on YouTube and in podcasts, and who are saying, as this kind of ideological commitment, that you ought to get back to studying Latin, they are 21st century neo-Nazis. And I would say to a much greater extent than the people doing Esperanto are left-wingers or communists. There's some flexibility there, some lassitude there. And to a much greater extent than the people studying Sanskrit or Pali are like ideologically committed to a revival of Buddhism or a revival of Hinduism, respectively. You'll find a lot of different weird eccentrics, in that bunch. Maybe the only thing I can compare Latin to this way is the study of Tibetan. If you talk to white people who are learning Tibetan, ancient Tibetan or modern Tibetan, they're doing a scholarly Buddhist Tibetan or modern Tibetan, wow, you are dealing with some fucking LARPers. These are people who don't just believe in Buddhism, they believe in Tibetanism. These are like Tibetan nationalists. It's fucking crazy. And you tell me if that's left wing or right wing. That's a good example. The crazy, crazy people you'll meet if you go into Tibetan as a language. Now, look, I have a hard time saying that anyone on earth is worse than the type of white person who learns Japanese. So some of you people are hashtag polyglot. When you sit in the classroom with white people studying Japanese, you are looking at the dregs of our species. You are looking at the worst elements of humanity, and you are seeing the basest desires. Like you're seeing them at their worst. Some people, okay, let's say a guy, he's an accountant, and he's a nice guy, and he's a good guy 12 hours a day. But if you meet him when he's at the casino, you see the worst side of his character. You see the worst of human nature. Like, okay, he's a good guy 12 hours a day, but a certain number of hours per day or a certain number of hours per week, he's at the casino and you see another side to him. White people studying Japanese are in this same way terrifying. You are looking at the worst aspects of the worst people in humanity. I really mean that. Well, I've got to tell you something. Latinists, people who choose to learn Latin, are even worse. You are either talking about traditional Catholic fascists. So note, I'm here saying traditional Catholic fascists, right? So it's a continuous tradition that includes people like Mussolini. It includes people like the dictator Franco in Spain, right? There's a tradition of Catholicism that continues to this day. They are either that kind of fascist or they are neo-Nazis, and the emphasis has to be on neo. I don't mean they are traditional Nazis who actually practice what Adolf Hitler preached. These are people with very eccentric, very new ideas, but they are fascist ideas. They're a different kind of fascism, right? Those are the people who dominate Latin. And you see, if you kind of read between the lines a little bit, okay, so here's one person you're examining, and they are obsessed with getting the pronunciation and emphasis correct when they recite Catholic prayer in Latin. That's what they're trying to impress upon you as a student. That's what they're trying to do with themselves. They believe there's something magical about singing a traditional Catholic song in Latin perfectly, getting the emphasis on the right syllable, getting the emphasis on the right syllable, is what we say in English. You know, that they have some kind of supernatural belief that this is their way to reach out and touch the mind of God. I hate to tell you this, people. The God of Israel did not give a fuck about Latin. The language of the God of Israel, the God in your Bible, was not Latin. Like, well, these people don't accept that. These are people who are still living with. We have a question here about the scholars of the Middle Ages. These are people who are struggling to revive the darkness of the Dark Ages, at least in their own minds, at least in their own hearts. This is one type of person you can be. You know, okay, now let's contrast. Over here is a guy, and what he's talking about is masculinity, what it means to be a man, and the Roman spirit, and the Roman military, and conquest, and what were the causes of the decadence and the decline and fall of Rome. You know, okay, that's another school. Now, a big difference between the 21st century and the 19th century. This is I'm sorry, but this is actually really important. In the 19th century, a huge percentage of the people interested in Latin were homosexuals who were trying to advance the notion that homosexuality was normal, that it shouldn't be a crime, that homosexuality wasn't just something that should be socially normal or legally normal, but that it was biologically normal. So they were going back to these ancient Roman texts, some of which contain very explicit descriptions about gay romance, gay prostitution, all kinds of homosexual skullduggery. You know, men cheating on their wives with other men, men cheating on their boyfriends with women, you know, like the whole gamut of shenanigans, you know. We get it spelled out for us real clearly. And we get all the details of the sex lives of different emperors. Some of them were straight, but a lot of them were gay or bisexual. Okay, there were a lot of homosexuals in the 19th century who were reaching out to these classical texts from ancient Rome to try to basically say, hey, I have a right to exist, right? What you will notice is that in the 21st century, these people who are studying Latin, whether they are openly neo-Nazis or not, like it may be covert, their real political agenda, for some reason, their idea of masculinity from ancient Rome is homophobic rather than homophilic, if you like, rather than embracing gayness and bisexuality. It's actively condemning it. They are instead constructing and asserting a patriarchal, heteronormative, you know, ultimately, I mean, the point is Islamophobia. I mean, that's really what it's about today. To some extent, it's about anti-Semitism, but primarily Islamophobia. They are, you know, constructing and articulating a new kind of xenophobia. Also, you could say a new kind of cosmopolitanism, a new view of both the history and future of Europe based on a very selective and biased reading of ancient Rome. You can look around. Any of these guys, people who are alive and active today in 2023. I'm not talking about the 19th century. I'm not talking about the 20th century. I'm not talking about the 18th or 17th century. People studying Latin right now, people talking about Latin on YouTube, do you see any of them with a sincere interest in democracy? Do you see any of them arguing, even to the same extent that Machiavelli did, Guys, what made Rome work, what made the empire work, was the limited extent to which it was democratic. Nobody would call the city of Rome a democracy, but it had some democratic elements. And long story short, what Machiavelli draws attention to, working from sources like Appian and Sallust, the great historians, he says, look, what you really got to consider is the way in which the rich and the poor worked together and struggled against each other. There were these democratic elements. And that's what really made Rome great, in contrast to the societies he saw around him in Italy at that time. He was also very much aware of the Muslim societies in the Ottoman Empire right next door, saying, look, guys, we've really screwed something up here. Rome had discovered something that really makes a society tremendously dynamic. And we lost, even if you think ancient Rome was only 10% democratic, we lost that 10%. Or if you thought it was 5% democratic, we lost that 5%. I'm not going to get into it at length, but Machiavelli did also have experience with city-states within Italy at that time that had a little bit of democracy. He saw how important that was in his own lifetime too, where there was, where there was some democracy. Well, gee, isn't it peculiar that in 2023, inasmuch as there is a renaissance of interest in Latin, it's not coming from the left wing. It's not coming from, shall we say, moderate centrists like Joe Biden. It's not coming from the Joe Bidens of the world. In the same sense that there's a very clear view of what the future world order should be embedded in Esperanto. I'm sorry, I'm going to repeat that. Esperanto, as a language, the body of people who are students of Esperanto, the body of people who are teachers and promoters of Esperanto, okay? There is a worldview they are preaching and teaching and advocating for, and it is embedded in the language. The reason for learning the language is this worldview. It's this view, not of the world in the past, but of what the world in the future ought to be. Well, with Latin in 2023, exactly the same thing is true. But the worldview, the view of what the world order in the future ought to be, that is dominant in the 21st century studying and teaching of Latin, is nothing less than fascist. If anything, you can just say it's divided between traditional Catholic fascists and somewhat more forward-looking, somewhat more eccentric 21st century neo-Nazis.